Hi folks, you're with Tacitus today at your Pushback channel, and thank you for joining this audio live stream. In this essay, I'd like to talk about the decline of South Africa. Now, I just want to give you a statistic here to just illustrate the sort of difference in the social situation in South Africa as opposed to, say, a country of equivalent population. So they've got 60 odd million in South Africa population. So, give or take about the same population as England, for example, or some other European, France and so on. So let's have a look at the one indicator is the amount of murders that are going on. That would sort of implicate or at least illustrate the degree of social unrest and so on that goes on there. Now, last year in England, there were about 700 murders, most of which, around 90% of which were recent brown and black immigrants murdering each other. So even that's an inflated figure for England. But so how many murders do you think there were in South Africa in that equivalent period? So 700 in England, about the same population or close enough. 700 murders for the whole 12 months in England. This is, I think, 2021. And in South Africa, during that same time period, there were over 29,000 murders. Now, given that the police don't bother to go and check in the outer rural areas where again, quite a few murders take place, no one actually knows the number. So you can, the recorded number is 29,000, but there are, and everyone accepts this, there are additional murders happening in the rural areas the police don't even bother with. So, lower working class sort of black people murdering each other, and kind of even the black law enforcement authorities just don't really care. So the number's greater than that. Now, that seems like an astonishing number of murders. Now, if you add to that the truck jackings, the carjackings, and other factors, clearly indicating high levels of violence and social dislocation and just lack of law and order, then you get some idea of what it's like in South Africa. And now I can add other things too, like even in the major population centres, blackouts, electricity blackouts of 8 to 12 hours a day are common, and people who fear for their safety, because a lot of people now won't go out at night or won't go out at these times. Similarly, if there's say there's a storm or something and power lines or mobile phone towers are sort of damaged or knocked over or something like that, repair companies or people won't go out at night. They just plain won't go out. Or even if they go out in the day, if it's outside of the metropolitan area, they won't go out unless they have a police protection, a police escort, and there and back, and so on. So repairs that need to be made sometimes aren't made for days while they're waiting for a police escort. Now, for a country that's getting as poor as South Africa, but has such grandiose spending plans, particularly if it's involving buying multi-gazillion-dollar mansions for the black elites, the corrupt black elites, no less. But they cut back on budgets, so they're attempting to be fiscally sort of responsible, but they'll have a budget for say any government department, but the affirmative action policies and diversity and inclusion policies have to stay fully funded, even while everything else is stripped of funding. So you have this absurd thing where these instrumentalities and government departments are still hiring, black people and unqualified affirmative action type black people, whilst being totally unable to deliver any of the services they're supposed to be responsible for. So you've got a very strange sort of series of internal contradictions. Now, new wealth isn't being created at anywhere near the rate they need to maintain the levels of spending, so the downward spiral is already well underway. And if we look at pretty much every measure of say, exports, or even local production. It could be food, it could be anything. There's very little that seems to be anywhere near the levels it was when the white people were in charge. Now, one of the interesting sort of facts, if you look at the alleged statistics of the South African economy, there's a claim that in the 10 years following the end of white rule, so the 10 years following the end of white rule, that 10 years, the economy of South Africa grew, this is measured in GDP terms, it grew by 300%. So that is the most staggering economic growth sort of ever in human history. That's and it happened exactly as, from the moment that the white people were taken away from controlling the economy, suddenly it grew incredibly as the black people took over, and as every capable white person who had any skills at all was madly scrambling to get out of the country. So as the country was losing all of their skills and expertise and experience, their economy somehow grew by, again in GDP terms, by 300%. So clearly that's an utter and absolute nonsense. Or the methods of measurement were so creative as to and infantile as to be not worth a pinch of shit. That could have been done through things like exchange rate manipulations and various other things like that could have been used to bolster that. But so I just want to talk a little bit about South Africa and come back to that, and I'll just let this sink in. There were 700 murders in England in 2021 and over 29,000 murders in South Africa in that same period. Now, you don't need to be a genius or a social justice warrior to sort of look at that and be aghast at the issues. Now, it's mostly black tribes, the people in black tribes and the gangsters and the gangs killing each other. I do understand that, but that's hardly the material point here. 29,000 fucking murders in 12 months, and you got a population of 60 million or something. I mean, that's insane. And again, in the rural areas where a lot of black people do live in South Africa, the murders they don't even bother to record them. Who cares? So the murders could be well in excess of 29,000. Nobody knows the true figure. But again, it's a pretty sort of a dismal picture of how things are in South Africa at the moment, and how they've been allowed to descend into this level of squalor, even though as soon as the black people took over, South Africa was meant to enter this nirvana and paradise that has known no equal. But in fact, the opposite is always the case when the whites are taken away from control, that it's gone backwards at a rate of knots. Now, I just want to talk about the apartheid thing. People sort of mention the word apartheid in the same way as they would mention Nazi or something. In fact, the two are often put together. The Nazi fascist apartheid system, Hitler, and we need to sort of just understand what apartheid was. When the whites, which was originally the Dutch settlers, because the Dutch had spice, they did a lot of trading in spice that they were buying around from Indonesia and places like that. The Dutch needed a way station to re-victual the ships and so on. And this was before the Suez Canal. The only way to get from Europe to the east was via South Africa, so the ships had to go there. And by the time the ships which left Europe and arrived South Africa, they needed re-victualling and taking on fresh supplies and fresh water and so on. So the Dutch decided to build or create if you like, a way station there in what was called Cape Town, and so they did that, and some quite enterprising, very hardworking Dutch people started to create farms there, because there's nobody there. No black people lived there at the time in that area, that wider area that became known as Cape Town. So they the soil was a bit ordinary. The irrigation wasn't there, so they had to put a lot of work in to turn that area in the hinterland into good farmland to grow grow crops and to graze, cows and sheep and so on, pigs and whatever. And this created, as the Dutch international trade grew, and the Dutch were very active in the international trading scene at the time. There were so many ships passing by that pretty much everything that you grew and in terms of produce and meat and so on, everything you grew you could sell to the ships as they went by, and that's both ways. The ships heading towards Asia and the ships coming back to fully laden with spices and so on to sell in Europe. So this was a real huge business opportunity for the people there, and Cape Town became a very, very successful colony based on this ship revictualling. But there was no black people around at the time. It was all white people built the farms, built the nation. Now, as South Africa sort of grew bigger and more prosperous, and particularly when the Dutch were unfortunate to back the wrong side in one of the European wars, and so the British ended up, the Dutch had to concede this colony, Cape Town, and the areas around it had to concede this colony to Britain. So they grew even further and quite quickly once it was incorporated into the British world empire at the time, because that was a huge trading network, and it grew quite substantially from there. Now, the black people in the blacks further north to where the South Africa is today, they were under a lot of pressure from the Zulus, a very murderous, warlike nation at the time. Were under a lot of pressure from the Zulus, so they were moving south. The Bantus and so on, they were being displaced and moving south, and so they thought, well, hey, these white boys are doing okay down there. Let's go and have a piece of this action. And again, it's very much a black communal thing that they have all over Africa and still have in wherever blacks have gone, like the Caribbean and the Americas and so on. There's a very communal concept of ownership. I mean, it's almost communist, a very communal concept of ownership. And so they see all the wealth that these white people have, and it must have appeared by magic. These big stone buildings just appeared out of the ground. And so the blacks came in looking for work and wanting a piece of this bounty. Now, to the whites I think made a big mistake at the time, but they thought, wow, look at all this cheap labor. Yeah, hey, this sounds good. And so, they took in these black people, and when the British arrived, they stopped all this sort of what would have been quasi-slavery, I suppose, at the time. But the blacks were willingly moving into South Africa, again under pressure from the black Zulus that were in the north and pushing south, and the Dutch and the British were taking up more land that again wasn't good quality land. So you might have some hunter-gatherer type people running around it, but there was no black cities or towns or anything like that. This was raw land that was untouched, that the Europeans, the white folks, made something of. Turned the area into very productive farms, and later on we're finding things like gold and diamonds, and which had very little value to the black people saw no value in that sort of stuff, particularly not the diamonds. But anyway, so and the blacks had no capacity to mine, so that was all white technology that did that. But as the colony, as the area, the nation became richer as it did, then more and more blacks were coming in, thinking, hey, here's a cozy gig, not unlike the black migration to the white West happening today. And so a lot of blacks were arriving, and to keep the blacks separate, they wanted the cheap black labour, but they didn't want to live next door to the black people, which is an attitude in the elites today in Sydney. I'm more than happy for mass migration. I just don't want those damn black and brown people living near me, say the wealthy elites. And it was the same then in South Africa. So let's keep the black people separate. Let's create townships. They can go back to their black origins whenever they want. But if they want to stay here in South Africa, then we have to keep them in separate townships and separate areas so that they don't run riot, because the blacks are always killing each other. They've always been doing it. It's not something that they just started to do yesterday. So apartheid was to keep the behaviourally different people that happened to be black. Well, I don't think it was a racist thing in itself at all. Keep the black people separate in their own towns and townships, or even creating separate black states within the greater South African region. So this was something that this is what the apartheid was, keeping them separate. So, but it was treated as the blacks were always there. You've taken their land, you fucking Nazis, and then you're keeping them separate. Apartheid. And then people in the West had no idea what that word meant. Apartheid. It must be Nazi. Oh, Hitler. And without any concept of what the word meant or how it was meant to be or how it was applied. And that's all it was, keeping those behaviourally different blacks separate from the white population. So, but still wanting or using their cheap labour. I think that was a tactical sort of politico-tactical mistake. But hey, that was how it was. And there were Indian trading companies that were operating in South Africa, and they were using black slave labour effectively quite happily, and no one complains about them. It was only bad if whites were doing it. So again, we see that silly double standard. So now apartheid, from a strictly moral, if you just look at it from a strictly moral perspective, well sure, it's got problems. It's just not a good look. But other than that moral, the strictly sort of moral, as in the righteous Marxist activist pushing it, then it's a problem. But not outside of that. It's a moral issue there. Economically, it made sense. Socially and organisationally, it made sense. And nor was the rules. If you like, the laws around apartheid sort of developed and varied sort of in the regions. Like if you're in the rural areas, there was a different sort of concept of separation because there's so much space. So the idea was that black people in groups couldn't come into the white areas unless they had a reason to be there, such as they had a job there or something like that. Now, the minute apartheid stopped, the blacks started arriving in the cities and pitching tents on median strips and the whole flavour of the place. Then the gangs arrived. Then the different tribes were there, killing each other with machetes, and this was what apartheid was meant to be stopping or preventing. So that's it. Now, in terms of since the black people took over, or since the whites were dislodged from government in South Africa, the place has gone to shit and quickly. Now, no one sort of disputes the terrible corruption of the black elites. How they're making themselves multi-gazillionaires and having all the fruits of a white advanced technological society suddenly at their fingertips. And they were like kids in a chocolate shop. They just went insane. Drinking deep, sticking their snouts as far into the trough as they could. No wonder the country went to shit. But when it was obvious that what was happening, that the whites, there was a mass exodus of the most capable white people. Anybody with transportable skills, doctors, dentists, business people, engineers, whatever, that they were all getting out as quickly as they could. And I worked alongside with quite a few of them in Australia and was very impressed with them. A lot of get up and go, a lot of energy, very intelligent, very keen to succeed. And I'm one of these weird folks. I really enjoy working alongside very bright, capable people with high energy and high achievement sort of to their credential. I enjoy working alongside and being with those sort of people. I mean, there aren't necessarily that many of them around at the best of times, but there was a surplus of them coming from South Africa. I didn't quite appreciate at the time that those were all the brightest people. So I was seeing a very, very loaded and stacked sort of cross-section, if you like, of South Africans. There are plenty of not so bright white South Africans, some of which you see now. The mechanic who's married to the nurse, and they're both covered in tattoos, that sort of thing. So, not that they don't deserve to come here. Mechanics and nurses are needed skills, but the loss of talent and skill and experience out of South Africa was just, wow, no country can afford to lose that amount of talent and skill. Now, the government tried to stop people from leaving South Africa by not allowing them to take their money out. This was used as a measure to sort of stop the flow of talented white people out of the country. So what the white people ended up doing was setting up all sorts of crazy scams, like opening up branch offices in all the white, Australia as an example, opening up a branch office and then gradually moving the wealth and the people around so that they could, so they'd staff the office with people there on temporary work visas, and then would gradually apply for citizenship. But it also would allow them to move wealth around and not trespass upon the preventing of moving of wealth from South Africa to other countries. So the business, for example, would buy someone's house. Then as a business, it would sell that house, but would invest the money in opening up a branch office in Australia. Those types of things. Insurance scams were rampant as a way of moving money out of South Africa and into other countries such as Australia. So so all these scams and schemes that were in some ways, I think, justified insofar as skilled white people could then still leave the country. It's different for people like farmers. You can't just pick up your farm and move it to another country. Not that your skills aren't transportable, but you still have to kind of start again from nothing. So this was a way that the skilled white business people in professions were able to move, and they did en masse out of South Africa. So this has contributed, of course, to South Africa's decline. But I think South Africa would have declined anyway, because the affirmative action policies have removed white people from nearly all positions of responsibility and authority, and white people of expertise have been relegated to lower levels, and affirmative action has given the black people all the key roles and we see the same in the West, education, business, government, public services, and so on. So it's been, South Africa's turned into an absolute basket case. Even if the economy is not on the ground, or not on the floor yet, which it clearly is heading that way. This idea of when you, if you've got 29,000 plus murders in a year out of a population of 60 million, you've got a fucking problem. So I don't see that they're making any effort to address it. Again, the attitude is the same as sort of Chicago in the United States, where the blacks are shooting each other in the downtown areas and nobody cares. To me, why wouldn't you care? It's an issue, isn't it, when people are shooting each other in the main street? But and it's the same in South Africa. This sort of intriguing me, that the black government takes an attitude that if it's black tribes and black gangs shooting each other, that it's no big deal, and yet it is. You've been with Tacitus today as your pushback channel, and thank you for listening.